this lecture or this hour because we have the whole time. But I will talk about it a little bit. So I know we started this yesterday, but I am going to read it again to keep it in our minds. After this, he went, meaning Jesus went down to Capernaum to stay with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. So I mentioned to you that Capernaum became Jesus' home base. So when he went home, he didn't go home to Bethlehem or to Nazareth. He went home to Capernaum. It was his headquarters, and they were probably at Peter's house. We know that Jesus did go to Peter's house, and so that's probably where he stayed. And then it says the Passover of the Jews was at hand, was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold pigeons, "Take these things away, for do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. We talked about Capernaum, which is on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, and Peter lived there, and that became Jesus' headquarters, if you will, when he was during his ministry. This is an ancient ruins of a synagogue that was built by the Romans, and the aerial view, and that's maybe Peter's house. Hopefully it's Peter's house, or I'm not sure, but we can't be sure about that. So the time is the Passover, and we talked all about the Passover, so you should be able to remember that. It was to be an annual event, and it has been ever since. It was originally billed as the Lord's Passover, because he was the one that was passing over, right? But eventually, by the time of John, it became the Jews' Passover. Now, they say that that's the degeneration of the celebration, and that's possible, but I don't know that we can know that for sure. That was what John was trying to say. And then we looked at how massive the temple was, and what was done there. And then this is, I probably should have read this to you yesterday. This is one of those prophecies of Jesus. For zeal for your house what has consumed me, and the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen to me. Reproach just means to be disrespectful. Zeal for God's house was part of what Jesus was doing. And again, you can see the reproaches of those who reproach you, God, have fallen on me, and that means it fell on Jesus. And we talked about how what was going on in the temple was sacrilegious, and it would be like doing commercial things, or having a casino in your church or something like that. It was disrespectful to God. and to the temple itself. And then here's another prophecy of Christ, and it says this: "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way for me." Who was that? John the Baptist. "And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight. Behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap." So he cleanses things, right? He refines and cleanses us. Now, here's the thing. I think that is a prophecy of two different things at the same time. And there are a number of prophecies that are prophecies of two different things at two different times. Both of them are about Jesus. I think this is speaking about the cleansing of the temple. But Jesus will come to the temple again at the end of time, and the same thing will happen. He will refine those things, and others will not be able to stand, right? And he will come suddenly again, and we don't know when, and nobody knows when except for but the Father and Jesus. So uh, so we're going to talk about what we learn about Jesus from this story. And he is, by the way, he is fulfilling those prophecies even in the temple. So the very court that should have been a house of prayer for all nations, that was the purpose of the temple, had been degraded to a place that looked more like a crowded mall at Christmas. So this story isn't about the temple. It's not even a story about the cleansing of the temple. It's about who Jesus is. Who is this guy? What does this story tell us about Jesus? These are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So one of the things we learn about him, and I don't think these are the most important things, but these are things we learn from this lesson. The boldness and the strength of the Lord. Some people see him as very passive, but he wasn't. And he was a carpenter. He was a day laborer. So I don't know that he was, he probably was short, because most Jewish men were somewhere around 5'4". But in that day, but he wasn't a milquetoast either. He was a carpenter, and he wasn't timid and shy. He was bold, and he rebukes these people, and he never backed down in that. And he knew from the beginning that he was going to a cross. Crucifixion, and we'll talk more about this next year, is the most horrific, painful death that someone can die. And he lived with that knowledge, knowing that he was going to a cross. I can't imagine how hard that had to be for him to live with that, knowing all the time what was going to happen. Yes. Yeah, so it is one of the reasons is it takes so long to die. In fact, he was on that cross all day, and when they came to him in the evening, they were surprised that he was already dead. Sometimes it took days. And then it isn't just the nails in the wrists and through the top of the foot. it was also when you were crucified, everything in your body goes out of joint. And so and you have this searing pain going up. We'll talk more about this next year. I'll give you I'll read to you a medical doctor's understanding of a crucifixion and how torturous it was. So for a number of reasons, it is. That's not my opinion. That's the opinion of scholars. That it's the most horrific to die. So I can't imagine of him how hard that was for him. So we see the boldness and strength of Jesus, and then we see the holiness and wrath of God. We love the holiness of God. We don't like the idea of wrath. We don't. I remember reading in high school before I was a believer, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," which was written a long time ago, in the 1700s, 1800s, something like that, a long time ago. And I remember it scaring me, right? But as I grew up and as I became a believer, I realized that it was right. That it is the Bible even says it is an awful thing to come into as a sinner to a holy God. So that's the AKB, by the way. That's the version of the Bible. God's wrath is on. It isn't on us. It's on sin. And it's on Satan. And I don't know if you've ever seen anything completely unjust or completely horrible, but something like, I don't know, child abuse or burning people alive and murders. And if that doesn't get you angry, something's wrong with you, right? There should be something in you that's going, that's not right. And you need to make that thing right. God's wrath is on those who are hurting other people and are doing horrific things to people. He is a holy God. He's not your grandpa. I'm going to talk about that again. He's not Santa Claus. He's not the big man upstairs. He is a holy God, and he cannot have anything to do with sin. So Christ knew he was going to go to a cross, and he knew how people would react to him, how many would rebuke him, but he never stopped. He never stopped doing what his Father told him to do. So here's the thing. The reason, and it says this in the Bible, the reason that God's wrath is on the world is because of sin, because of all the horrible things that happen. And God doesn't wink at sin. I think sometimes we're just like, I'm not that bad. I never killed anyone. That's a high bar, isn't it? Yeah, right. Yeah, I never killed anyone. But there are people in prison right now that have killed someone who think they're basically good. And so God doesn't wink at our sin, and neither should we. He's not your grandpa. You can get away with stuff with grandparents that you can't get away with your parents, right? Isn't that right? So when Josh was about 3 years old, and he was my only kid at the time, we were over at my mother's house. I lived 2 houses away across the street from my parents for their last years. I was there so that I could help my mother take care of my father, who had Alzheimer's. And so I was at my mom's house, and I was a stay-at-home mom, and Josh was my first kid, and I stayed a stay-at-home mom for a long, long time until Lane went to Cornerstone. And I was at my mom's house, and I don't know what day it was. My dad wasn't around, so it was probably a school day, and he. Josh was watching TV, and I don't remember what he did, but he did something, and it ticked me off. And I went over there, and I don't know what I said to him. I didn't, berate him, but I corrected him, and he looked at me. This 3-year-old boy looked at me and said, "Mommy, I don't like your attitude right now." And I'm like, I'm not real thrilled with yours either. And then I look over at my mother, and she is laughing. And she's laughing at this. And I'm like, don't you laugh. You wouldn't have laughed if it was 3-year-old Amy saying this to you. But it was different. And I get it now. Like my son and daughter-in-law will get so upset at their children. Like, they're fine. Don't worry. They're adorable. It's okay. You're fine. Because I'm a grandma, right? But I wasn't that way with my kids. And God doesn't have grandchildren. He only has children. You're either his child or you're not. And that's the only two choices. And he does not wink at our sin. You know why? Because our sin, your sin, my sin, put Jesus on the cross. He had to die because we're sinners. And that is no laughing matter. God loves sinners, but he hates sin because of what it does to us and to others. So it's strange, though, anyway, that nobody fought back. At least the story doesn't say others came around him and rushed him or anything like that. They seemed to, maybe they were shocked, I don't know. But he was able to drive these people out of the temple. And they ran for cover. Even the temple police and the ruling authorities were powerless against him. So he had to exude some sort of authority to be able to do that. The response the people to Jesus' wrath was to ask, "By what authority do you do this?" That meaning, where do you get the right? Now, I'm gonna ask you a question. I already know the answer. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, Mrs. Schrock comes in here and starts flipping chairs. Is any one of you going to say, by what authority do you do this? I'm not. I am not going to do that, right? And Mrs. Schrock is not going to do it either. But Dr. Schrock, excuse me. Mr. Schrock. Yeah, definitely. I mean, he's the age of my kids. So, I have a 34-year-old, so that's older than that.
How old did you think he was?
The only of my children that is younger than him is Lane, and Lane is only 2 or 3 years.
Wait, that means.
Hey, I've told you how old I am.
I don't pay attention to ages.
I'm 63 years old.
Oh, I thought you were like early.
Wait, hold up.
What? What?
I'm 63 years old.
I thought you were early.
Do the math. Oh, wow.
If she was early,
You're my new favorite student. I don't know.
If she was early 50s and she was a kid of 34, she would have had it when she was 16. Think about that.
I mean, that happens. What?
I did not. I did not have. The source of Christ's authority is his deity. He is God. So he doesn't need to fear anyone. And he has authority. Usually we have authority. I have authority in this classroom. That's right. So that's because of my position. But that Jesus' position wasn't the reason why he had authority. He had authority because he was God. He had authority because of who he was, not what he was. And he had no reason to fear anyone about anything. So let me see how much time we have. The next thing I need to talk about is how do we see his deity. I need to. Yeah, we got a little time. Let's do that. So the question is, and you don't have to answer it because I'm going to answer it for you, how do we see Christ's deity in this passage? Remember again, these were written that you may believe, and that by believing you might have life in his name. Okay, so he calls the temple his Father's house. Now we talk about God as our Father, but that's in a different sense. Do you need to show me something? So Jesus was and still is jealous to preserve the honor and glory and holy purpose of our God and God's house, and so he reacted to that in an appropriate way. So he calls the temple my Father's house, and then he claims he will raise up his own body from the dead, which he ends up doing, right? But it must have sounded crazy to the people who. I mean, how crazy would you think I was if I said something about that, about my son? Because they didn't realize who he was. They thought he was crazy. He claims, so Christ's response to the people's desire for a miracle is to refer to his own resurrection. And he did raise himself. They didn't realize that then, and they don't realize it now. But it's true. And we'll talk more about that as we walk through actually the next 3 years. So that phrase, destroy this temple, is defined by verse 21. What he's saying is, crucify me, and I will raise myself up on the third day. But the people thought that he was talking about the physical temple, the stones of the temple. Since they were spiritually blind, I don't know. That's what it says here. I wouldn't say they were spiritual. Well, I think they were spiritually blind. But about this, I mean, what would you think if someone said that, right? They just didn't understand. It was here we see again, I told you, misunderstanding is a theme in John. This is another misunderstanding. You're going to raise yourself up from the dead? Yeah, right. That doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen, does it? Unless you're God. And he is. He claims that, so apparently the disciples did not understand what he meant either at that time. However, verse 22 tells us that after he rose from the dead, they remembered what he had said. So even they didn't understand what he was saying. Again, misunderstand. And they didn't, I don't know if they didn't believe it, but they certainly didn't understand. And after his resurrection, then everything made sense. Listen, I want to tell you that the disciples were cowards until Jesus' resurrection. They were hiding. they didn't, Jesus died, and they went into hiding. There was only one disciple at the cross. As soon as he was arrested, everybody else fled. But after he rose, they were completely in, even to the point of being willing to die a martyr's death. Every single one of the disciples, other than Judas and John, were martyred. And not one of them recanted. John lived to be a very old man. He died a natural death. But all the others died for their faith without ever denying. And that is very convincing evidence of who Jesus is. So they didn't understand at that moment, but it made sense to them eventually. And so Jesus is comparing his death to the purpose of the temple. How was Jesus the temple? What was the temple for? Yeah.
It's pray to God.
So he ended sacrifices, and even the Jews stopped sacrificing. They don't sacrifice anymore. What? The dwelling place of God. Yeah. So the temple was the place where people met God and felt His presence. And what Jesus is saying, that's no longer needed, because Jesus is now the place where we meet, right? And we don't need that temple to do that. I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick up here tomorrow, and I think we'll be done.